Hello and welcome everyone to America's Job Exchange's presentation of Tackling the Outreach Requirement, Strategies for Compliance. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Before we get started, I have just a few quick housekeeping notes to go over. This webinar is designed for you, our listeners, so please submit questions at any point during the broadcast via the chat box. At the end of the presentation, we will get to as many questions as we can. If we're unable to answer your question due to time constraints, we will get back to you via email. Please allow a little extra time for an email response as our presenter is going on a much-deserved vacation directly after this broadcast, but we promise we will get back to you. Also, we often get this question, so I'll address it up front. We will be sending a link to this presentation, the recording, and the slides in a follow-up email to you all, so you can look for that later today. Finally, at the end of this event, there will be a short survey that pops up. We would greatly appreciate you taking a minute to answer those questions and provide some feedback if you're inclined to do so. We'd love to get suggestions on what topics you'd like to see featured on future events. So, with that being said, let's get on with today's fantastic speaker. I am so pleased to introduce Sonia Chapin, SPHR, CCP, Managing Consultant at Berkshire Associates. Sonia is responsible for the development and implementation of affirmative action planning, audit support, and compensation services at Berkshire, and we're so glad she's here today to speak about outreach. It's a topic that's become prominent in recent focus reviews and of concern to us all. Sonia, thanks for being here, and I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lauren, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm certainly here and excited to share some strategies for outreach. As was mentioned, I am a consultant here at Berkshire Associates, and my focus is on audit support for our clients. So I do the day-to-day affirmative action planning, and I also have sort of narrowed my focus in the recent, let's say about 18 months or so, and I have been working with our clients that come under audit from the OFCCP. And so what we have done for you today is we have put together a quick presentation on specifically the outreach requirements that are part of an affirmative action plan. This is an area that has not seen a lot of emphasis in, I would say, probably the past 10 years or so. In the past 2 years or so, it has actually become a lot more of an impact and a focus of the agency. And so we thought it was a good time to bring you this presentation. And we're going to try to do that in a little bit of, hopefully, a fun way, at least as much as we can as it pertains to outreach. So what we're going to talk about today is the audit requirement and the definition of outreach. And we'll talk about that for all of the 4 groups that are covered by the AAP. And then we'll give you some tips in terms of preparing your outreach efforts for all targeted groups. So we've come up with a nice little acronym, and we'll walk you through what a good implementation will look like of an outreach program. Because we do have kind of an eye on the OFCCP audits, we'll also talk about tracking and evaluating your outreach efforts. And we'll talk through a few of the audit questions that we've seen recently, and as well some tips for compliance. And not listed on the slide, but also a part of our presentation today is going to be that question and answer session. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and submit them through the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time that we have today. So with all that being said, I thought I would start with what is actually in the scheduling letter when it comes to outreach. These are not the regulatory requirements. This is kind of the more real world. What do folks actually need to produce to the government when they come under audit as it pertains specifically to these outreach assessments? I should say that this is for the Section 503 reviews as well as the establishment reviews, also the CMCEs, which is the corporate management reviews that the agency is currently undertaking. And so even though that's not listed on the slide here, it is also applicable in those types of audits. We just don't have as many of them, so it's just not listed here. But what we're looking for and what the agency is expecting contractors to be able to produce are results of the evaluation of the effectiveness of outreach and recruitment efforts. And specifically for items 7 and 11, this is qualified individuals with disabilities or protected veterans. And there's also a requirement for this as it pertains to the goal attainment report in the establishment review, in terms of where do you have goals for your minorities and women, and then what are you doing in order to make sure that you're casting a wide enough net to meet those goals throughout the course of the plan year. So that's items 7 and 11 for the establishment reviews. For the 503 letter, it's item 4, and this information is only requested for IWDs. So the good part of a 503 review is that perhaps we're only focused on the individuals with disabilities. The bad part of a 503 review is, at least as we know them now, they're going to include an on-site component. So kind of a little bit of our trade-off for our contractor groups in that area. So that's what's actually required in the letters. In the compliance check letter, which is what we're seeing the agency schedule at this point in time, and they seem to have started with their compliance checks and with their CMCEs. We have seen a couple of 503 letters come out at this point in time, and a very limited number of establishment review letters at this point in time. It does look like the agency is kind of working through the first 3 types of audits first before they start their establishment reviews. So the compliance check, the 503, and the CMCEs are the ones that we're predominantly getting letters for at this point in time. If you do have a compliance check letter, this is kind of the easier of the types of audits that you can get. There's only 3 things that are requested in the letter, although there's 5 things that end up being submitted as a general sort of routine approach to these audits. So item 1 is actually the goal attainment report from the plan. The protected veteran and the IWD outreach assessments are what's included in item 1 for the compliance checks. And it's kind of unclear at this point in time if we need update data. I have submitted compliance checks both with and without update data. Both of those contractors were in their update time period, and so both of them were accepted. So if you do have update information, especially if that information portrays your agency in a good light, it might not be a bad idea to include it. But it's also not clear that it will be specifically requested if it's not included in that first initial submission. So it's really kind of something that we're monitoring at this point. It's not specifically mentioned in the letter, and so most of the time the way that our contractors or our contractors that we know of tend to approach this is to say, well, I'm not going to provide it until it's requested. And then if it's requested, it's obviously a good idea to have it pooled and ready to go if it is. But we haven't seen that trend so far in our audits. So that's a little bit about what is actual sort of the real world, what's included and what is expected to be submitted. This is a little bit more from the regulations. And so this is taking a look at what is actually required, kind of delving into this outreach requirement. This is a couple of points about this. They are supposed to be appropriate outreach and positive recruitment activities. The way that we typically would define appropriate would be to identify those areas that you potentially are not meeting goals. And the number of metrics that we have that are included in the AAPs at this point in time are such that we can say, and we can actually start to determine these over as a trend, you know, from one year to the next, How are we doing in terms of hiring and in terms of getting these folks into our applicant pools? And those are the types of things that the agency is looking for and have been requesting in the audits that I've been supporting. So taking a look at a very sort of honest approach of, where do we have potential deficiencies when it comes to actual utilization of these groups? And then to the extent possible, what kind of outreach can we design that is targeted towards those individuals? And this is one of the few areas of the regulations where there is actually a little bit of consideration given to the contractor size. And we have been able to use this kind of to our in a positive way in our audits, because we have been able to kind of effectively make the case that with a smaller contractor, that the number of outreach efforts that should be required or expected of that contractor is different than that of a larger contractor. So really kind of depends upon what your particular organization looks like and how many of those outreach efforts are kind of expected. Now, with that being said, sometimes it's a little bit of an education process in terms of making sure that the auditor that you're dealing with knows the size of the agency, and to kind of inform them of, this is one of those times when we have to, kind of look at overall resources that are available to the contractor. But don't be afraid to take that into consideration as you're interacting with your compliance officers throughout the course of your audit. Something that is not dependent on the size of the contractor, though, is the amount of documentation that is expected in order to make sure that folks are keeping record of these outreach activities. And so this last bullet point is directly from the regulations, and it does say that all activities that are undertaken to comply with the obligations do need to be retained for 3 years. And this is where a lot of the documentation questions that we are seeing in audits currently come into play. And a lot of times we try our best to kind of keep it to the plan year that's under scrutiny. And that's definitely a good sort of process or tip to make sure that you sort of keep these outreach efforts very closely focused, especially if you have one of those compliance check letters. It should be very narrowly focused just for the previous plan year. And so let's translate that for us kind of sitting in our offices, these regulations that exist. What is outreach? And again, I actually kind of pulled these from the regulations because it gives you an idea of what the agency means when they're saying outreach. So they're looking at, for example, the Department of Veterans Affairs regional office. They would consider a contact to that particular agency, if you will, a positive outreach that a contractor could undertake. The Ticket to Work Employment Network Directory. Keep in mind that these are from the regulations, and so they haven't evolved to the point where our contractors currently are. So this is what this is where they're coming from. And these are the types of things that essentially they are looking for in an audit situation. I would kind of call out 2 bullet points on this screen. The next to the last one, private recruitment sources, such as professional organizations that specialize in the placement of IWDs or protected veterans or minorities or women. This is where most of our contractors are having kind of the most impact in terms of what they're trying to do with their outreach. Is they're looking at posting with the State Employment Service as kind of the floor of what they need to do in order to be compliant. We know that we need to do that because it's required by the regulations. And then outreach activities are specifically what the agency is looking for, at least, is specific things that are going to go beyond what's simply required by the regulations. And again, to the extent possible, target those outreach activities to those areas where you have goals And then if you're doing that, or if you put in place a program that allows you to do that on a kind of a regular basis, then it's definitely something that you'll be able to showcase those efforts in case of an audit and send off to the OFCCP and not have any sort of difficulties from that perspective. The second bullet point to sort of pull out is the best practices here. So you all will receive a copy of the presentation, and that will be a link, and it does actually link out to the OFCCP's website. And this is something that they've developed a little bit more recently. So it's a little bit more sort of from contemporary times, and it includes things like online internet outreach and things along those lines. So take a look at that. That's what the agency, their effort to kind of update what they're expecting in terms of outreach. And take a look at that. And then my recommendation would be to kind of pick one or two and develop a strategic approach to those efforts. And as much as you can, if you're looking at putting a new sort of activity plan into place, as much as you can say, you know, this is the result of the current AAP that we've done. We sort of took a look around and we said, what can we do better? And one of the things that we used was an OFCCP resource, and we decided to focus on these two areas, you know, from the list of best practices. That will go over very well, in my experience, in an audit situation, because the agency does want to see contractors using the AAP as a way of sort of strategically looking at what you're currently doing, identifying potential areas or concerns that you may have in those areas, and then taking positive steps to get sort of closer to compliance or closer to effective compliance from there. So a lot of times there's a little bit of a reluctance to say we put these particular items in place, but I would, to the extent possible, and certainly within certain limits, you know, say that it is definitely a good idea to sort of take a look around and design new activities, and you know, not to be afraid to say these are fairly new activities and we've implemented them because we're trying to become more compliant. And so the very first step in terms of looking around at your current outreach activities is to look at what you're currently doing. So take a moment, take a step back and look at what the organization is actually doing. So take a look at what your current procedures are, what is currently happening within the organization, and don't forget to take credit for what's already being done, because a lot of times there are things that are done that maybe aren't tracked appropriately, or we don't have the appropriate documentation in place, but they are being done. And don't be afraid to kind of say this, you know, starting right now, we're going to assume that this is our outreach activity. You know, even if it's providing meeting space for community groups, if it is a type of outreach that builds the brand in sort of the greater business environment, but doesn't directly result in hires. For example, if you have like a high school outreach day or something like that, where your managers go out and sort of share what your organization is doing to, you know, a local high school. Obviously, that's not going to result in any direct hires, but it definitely helps get the company's name out there and starts to build that employer sort of brand out there in the workforce. So don't be afraid to sort of take that creative approach to those outreach methods that are currently happening, or potentially apply that creativity to new outreach methods. And one of the ways that we often talk about with our clients is don't forget vendor outreach. So the overall goal is to support diverse individuals in our workforce and in our sort of overall workforce in the United States. So how can we do that, especially if you're in a particular industry that it's difficult to employ a particular type of targeted individual? Take a look at how that can be done, maybe not directly through your organization, but through business partners. And so that's when we start to have discussions around, you know, what do your vendor relationships look like? Is there a particular type of, you know, office services where we can potentially say, you know, we would like to particularly target the employment of these individuals, and then don't be afraid to take credit for that if it does result in a good in a good placement for the organization. So once you've taken a look at your current activities and you have a feel for how your organization is doing now, what we recommend is that you prepare your outreach. And this is kind of looking at it as putting in place a new plan for your outreach activities. So if this is something that you'd like to sort of revitalize within your organization, something that you're able to say, this is something that we'd like to concentrate and focus on. This sort of gives you an outreach, I guess, framework, if you will, to develop that outreach program. And so, we came up with our little PREPARE acronym here, and we'll talk through what each one of these means. So the very first thing to do is to start with the AJE tool that is actually located under your local outreach. So when you log in, you do have an option up there at the top for local outreach, and this will help you kind of get off the ground in terms of getting your outreach program built. So you can pull down from here an Excel template, and we'll take a look at that on the next slide. But this will help you kind of begin to get a feel for what types of things should be included in your new outreach activities. And then once you have the Excel template populated, you can actually import it, and then you can begin tracking it within the system. So, so that's something that's available to you under your AJE login. So once you've got this template, and you can kind of see a picture of it there, and it gives you an idea of the type of information that is sort of tracked and what we're looking for each one of the sources as well as the activities. It's important to start with a plan that is, what does success look like in this particular area? So we're undertaking a new outreach initiative, and we want to know at the end of the day what we're going to call success. So it's very important to identify that, and it's not always a new hire. It's sometimes, again, building that brand out in the workforce. So keep that in mind. What is success when it comes to your organization? And then develop that plan outside of the outreach. So strategically, what does this mean that for our organization? And then, of course, because I'm in affirmative action planning, I like to have tracking methods and metrics. So are there any metrics? Is there anything that we can assign to this particular outreach activity that we're going to say it's a success? And there's a number of different sort of templates for that. OFCCP has kind of a 5-question analysis of, does this result in hires and things along that line. But I do encourage you at this point in the process to take a more creative, a broader view of success, because not all of your outreach activities are necessarily going to result in hires. But it's important to understand and to continue to engage in those activities, even if there isn't kind of a hire at the end of the day. So refine and execute. So refine, this a lot of times comes from experience, and sometimes our clients are very interested in putting together an outreach organization or an outreach sort of approach. And they say, we're going to do, these 5 or 6 different things, and we're going to make this happen this year. And a lot of times we don't end up having the focus that you need in order to make sure that it's successful within the first year. So once you've planned it, and once you've said, this is what we overall define as success, take 1 or 2 areas of that strategic plan and translate it into something that we can actually do this year. So what are impacts on the organization that we can actually make happen in the next 12 months? And this is where the sort of difficulty of organizational change comes into play, because it takes time. And it's also very small steps, especially in those first years. So don't be afraid to say, while at the very end of this process, this is what success looks like. At the end of 12 months, this is what success looks like for us. When you're looking at where you're going to focus your efforts in those first years, take a look at what are the goals in the AAP. Are there any other areas where we can say we're not necessarily meeting our goals, and we want to make sure that we're extending appropriate outreach to these individuals. Obviously, the goals in the AAP provide a very good idea in terms of where to start, but don't forget about those other areas outside of the AAP, and make sure that what you're looking to do actually, kind of helps to address those areas where there are potential areas where you're not meeting your goals. And then execute, go and do it. So once you know what it is to do, once you've identified those folks who are going to be responsible for it, this is the actual execution phase. So make sure that during the execution phase that you've got these achievable goals, and you've got these really good pieces of input where we're going to kind of try to push the organization to change. Make sure that during the execution phase that you're looking at past the comfort zone. So the folks who are in your sourcing department, in your talent acquisition department, make sure that you're constructively, of course, challenging what they've done in the past. So, and a lot of times this takes what this looks like is potentially asking hiring managers, well, why can't we consider this person? Even a job structure change where potentially if you've got a really good person who doesn't necessarily want to work full time, perhaps we can structure this job such in a job sharing capacity or something along that line. So this is not just looking at actual outreach and getting out and making those sort of community connections. It's also taking a look at your internal sort of assumptions within the organization and questioning why we are doing it this way. And that's what that last bullet point is. We always did it this way, right? We always did it this way. So here's what we're going to try. Maybe take one or two pieces of how we've always done it, change it up a little bit, and see what types of positive things come out of that. And sometimes just asking the question from an organizational perspective will bring about those types of questions. I'm not really sure why we've always done it that way. Yes, let's go ahead and try this little piece, we'll try it differently this way or this year, and we'll see how that happens. Permeate. So make these changes a part of your culture. As much as you can, you want to make sure that you're bringing about organizational change. And so at every part of the process, you want to try to make sure that you've got people focused on this. And that's why I think it's really important to do the refine step, because you're going to try to make these small steps and make those lasting changes a part of the organization, the organizational culture. So determine as part of this who your champions are, and potentially ask for their assistance throughout the course of the program. You'll find, I think, that folks try to come into play and they may have a particular interest in the little pieces and parts that you're trying to bring about change in. So you may have someone who's a former military person in your organization who puts their hands up and says, I'd like to be a part of this in terms of targeting protected veterans. So take a look at leveraging not just your sourcing and recruitment groups, but also your internal groups. And make sure, the last bullet point there, assess the whole employee experience. If you're attracting folks that are in these 4 groups and then they're not having a good experience within the organization, we're not actually, sort of changing the culture so that we're supporting these individuals once they're in. And then it becomes a more difficult process for sourcing and recruitment, because we keep going back to them and asking them to bring in more and more. But make sure that these folks are welcomed into the organization to the extent possible once they're here. And so sometimes that takes the point of maybe a mentor program, or even if it's just kind of an informal, we'd like to pair you with this new hire in this other department, and just kind of check in with them once a month and make sure that everything's going okay. So again, as much as you can, make it a part of the whole organization, and then also make sure that once they're in, it's not just the sourcing and recruitment team that's doing the work. We're pushing that down through all levels of the organization. So appraise, how are we doing? So take a look at what are the assessment of the efforts. And this sometimes means taking a look at what did we think that we were going to do at this point. Maybe this is a 6-month point, maybe it's a 12-month point, depending upon the length of your implementation, and say, what did we think that we were going to do that we maybe haven't done yet? Do we need to redouble the efforts in those particular areas? Ask those folks who have been seeing the change to provide input. Are there any ways that we should do this better? Be open to those feedback and those course corrections, because that will show all of your stakeholders across your organization that you're open to making this work. And so sometimes that means saying halfway through, what we thought was going to help is not, and we're going to try something else. So that's something that's, it's important to be able to say and to take that honest feedback and say, this is what we're doing differently. Those things are often included as well in OFCCP audits, in terms of, we put this new program into place. We thought that it was going to have this impact. It didn't. And so we course corrected, and we're trying something else. And even though sometimes there's a little bit of reluctance I've seen on the part of my clients to kind of say, well, we don't want to say that what we're doing isn't working, I think it's okay to say what we were doing wasn't working, so we changed it and we're going to try something else. And if that doesn't work, we'll continue to try other things as well. Results and evaluate. So take a look at those metrics. So we're getting to the end of our implementation, and take a look at those metrics, any of those that you had identified at the beginning stages, and calculate any of the results for those. Now, it's very hard to show that these outreach programs have impact, let's say, on time to hire. But take a look at it again creatively and say, is there some sort of positive impact on employee engagement or something along that line, where, did overall turnover go down? Are we bringing folks into the organization and then having them feel supported through various, internal programs that we may have? Review your 44K metrics. So those are the ones in the individuals with disabilities and in the protected veterans plans that identify the number of hires, the number of applicants, and then the number of IWD hires and IWD applicants within the organization. Take a look at what percentages are you hiring, and what percentages of your applicant pool are IWDs. Take a look at that from year to year. See if there's a measurable impact in terms of, last year we had 5%, this year we have 7.5%. While it doesn't sound like a large improvement, you're getting closer and closer to OFCCP expectations, which at this point is 7% for IWDs. So take a look at those across years to show the impact of these types of outreach activities on your organization's efforts. And then comments on the programs, if you've gotten anything positive or again negative, be open to change them throughout, from those folks that are actually being a part of the program. And then finally evaluate. So again, take a look at the whole employee experience. And this is where for me, the emphasis sort of shifts from external to an internal question. So we're saying, how are we doing internally in terms of employee engagement? What worked that we're going to continue, and what didn't work that we're going to discontinue and potentially try something new. And then, because we are all in HR, I added on a D so that we are now prepared for OFCCP audits, among other things, and we are going to document all the efforts, outcomes, and results that happened as a result of our organizational change efforts. It is really important, and it's not just for those locations on the CSAL, the list of audit locations that are coming under audit in the next 18 to 24 months, not just for those locations, but make sure the whole organization knows about the efforts, knows about the results, and are able to understand sort of why we're undertaking these activities. So documentation, of course, is a major part of anything in HR. But again, take a look at what worked and what didn't for the organization, and make sure that you sort of amplify the positives and correct those that are potentially, getting off track, maybe a bad fit for the organization or simply not producing results. And in that way, you sort of create your building blocks and then obviously build on those building blocks throughout the course of the year. And then again, I can't say it enough, but openness to feedback. You'll start to see the folks who are impacted by these organizational change efforts will see that you're open to feedback and that you're looking at making things that work for the organization. And I think that only fosters a good positive cycle of communication within the organization. So taking a look at assessment of outreach and recruitment efforts. Again, here, once we've sort of implemented our organizational change, there is a certain amount that we need to do from a compliance perspective to pull in all of those activities and to make sure that we're sort of translating them into something that can be used in our compliance efforts. And so take a look at the actual recruitment efforts that happened during the implementation of the outreach program and make an evaluation of the overall effectiveness of that program. And this is very important. And I should say that in the audits that I've supported recently, the OFCCP is really interested not just in the grids that we'll talk about in just a minute that kind of show everything that the company has done to undertake these outreach efforts, but they're also looking for kind of a thoughtful self-review of what did we do, how did it work, and again, what are we going to do differently? So come to a reasonable conclusion, taking into account the metrics that the agency will have, and that includes all of your IWD utilization statistics, your protected veteran hiring benchmark, obviously where you have goals for minorities and women within the plan, and take a look at everything and kind of say, this is how we're doing. And again, you certainly want to strike a positive tone when you're writing this assessment. But also don't be afraid to say these are things that we tried and they didn't work and we're going to try something different. So again, here, the third bullet point, it does say that we do need to document each evaluation and the criteria used to evaluate the effectiveness of each effort. And then, of course, the conclusion as to whether or not it was effective. So they are looking at this not just at the individual level, but also at the overall level. And then don't forget to highlight your internal efforts, like your employee resource groups. So to say that, you know, this is not something that is solely focused on bringing people into the organization. We strive to sort of re-recruit people into the organization by providing them a good supportive place to work. And so don't be afraid to include those on your list of outreach efforts. So getting down to what an actual sample evaluation looks like. Again, take a look at your utilization analysis, compare it to the prior year, see how you're doing. Are we at a positive trend or a negative trend? Again, the ability to include the targeted group in its workforce. Did it increase your name recognition with the audience, or identify specific openings that are available to the group? Even if that didn't result in an actual hire, it's something that we should kind of take a look at and make sure that we're including in our evaluations. And then, of course, the very easy to to identify ones are, did this actually result in an applicant? And then, did this actually result in a hire? And ideally, in an ideal world, you know, every outreach that you have results in more applicants and a qualified selection. Real world, that's not what's going to happen. And it's important to recognize that going in, that not everything is going to be, you know, is going to have that very positive end result. So here's an example that we use. The evaluation, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, does not need to be lengthy. It doesn't need to specifically say if there were any number of folks that were included, although if you have that information, it can certainly be included in the evaluation. But this gives you an idea in terms of what the date is, that outreach source, and then the description of what's happening, and then how it worked out for us. And make sure, again, at this point, when you're putting together these assessments, that you're taking credit for what you're already doing within the organization. Tracking them is the first step, and then being able to assess them and say, this is working for us, this is not working for us, is a very good sort of place where you want to end up. But it all does start with tracking. And that's why that Excel spreadsheet that we showed at the beginning will potentially be your friend as you go through this process, because you do want to capture all of that. So again, here's the documentation that can be pulled from your AJE tool, and that is this is an outreach report for a particular company, and as you can see, you can kind of filter it by what type of organization, the state, the city, certainly by date, and what kind of activities are included here. And so for those of you who potentially have a location on the Seesaw list, this is definitely one of those reports that you'll be pulling to kind of take a look at and say, this is what we're doing for this particular organization. And as you can see, it very much, it has, you know, places for your notes, and you can definitely identify different types of outreach within this particular report. Here again is kind of what our final documentation looks like, and this is sort of a big Excel spreadsheet. I don't actually submit this for my audits, but the outreach tool that you have access to can be used to generate this documentation. And then usually I would start to pull out, you know, maybe any blank columns, add in your specific notes about each activity, but in essence, this kind of distills down what the different areas are that we're taking a look at within the organization. So this is definitely something that you can kind of use to get started in terms of building your outreach reports in response to those letters that we saw, the items for the letter that we saw back at the beginning of the presentation. So keep in mind as well, that you can use the outreach tool just to kind of generate ideas. So there are over 9,000 entries within that tool. It can be searched by location. There's a lot of information that's available out there, and you can rate them, make notes for your own activities, and then at the end of the day, produce something like this for your audit. So that might be a really good place to start in terms of pulling down ideas for getting started on your outreach program. Keep in mind that a lot of times OFCCP is actually looking for documentation as well. So not just the list that you see here, not just the evaluation that you saw on the previous slide, but also, kind of taking a look at, being able to provide sort of final documentation that the outreach actually did occur. And I have had a fair bit of success in terms of adding in some pictures as well for my documentation. So for example, going back to the example that I gave before, if you do have some of your managers go out to a local high school, present on what the type of work that your organization is doing, taking a picture, maybe not necessarily of the students, but of at least your employees, presenting at the school, it makes it a little bit more real and a little bit more sort of easy to explain what type of outreach is happening. So don't be afraid to include pictures as well, especially if you're putting together those outreach, a response for the outreach pieces for those CSAL locations. So for those of you who do have some of your locations on that list, just for your edification, here are some questions that we've gotten in recent audits. And this is specifically targeted for IWDs, but we do see typical questions like these for protected veterans as well. We haven't seen the level of questions that you see on this slide, and I'll include them all here. We haven't seen this level of question for minorities and women, interestingly. At least I haven't seen them in the audits that I've supported recently. But a good one here is documentation showing the outreach efforts made towards IWDs. So in this case, what we submitted was kind of a grid that just said, here's what we did, here's what we think of it overall, and then we got this follow-up question. So it's kind of unclear what they're looking for when you get sort of this nebulous question like this, but it's really good to be able to provide like an email confirmation or something like that to say, yes, this did actually happen. And then in some cases where we had sort of limited evaluations of how effectiveness everything was with a particular set of outreach activities, you can see the last bullet point there, include the evaluations for all of the efforts that were made. So this kind of a good point to bring up here is that we're not just looking for the postings with the State Employment Service. They are looking for a little bit more information as it pertains specifically to outreach for these folks. Some other questions that we've seen, the outreach and recruitment efforts does not include the dates of the events. So in this case, we had just kind of said like October 2018, and then the minimum criteria it used. In this case, what we did was we went out to the OFCCP website, we pulled down the 5 questions, and we sort of answered those 5 questions for each of the areas that we had submitted. And again, here's kind of a loaded question. In light of the IWD utilization and number of applicants and employees who ID as disabled, does the contractor still believe that the outreach efforts were effective? That is an actual question, and you can kind of see where the agency is going with that question. Copies of articles on accomplishments of employees, so they're looking for highlights of these individuals within sort of company presentations, and then are there any specific policies and procedures to make sure that there's an anti-harassment policy in place? So those gives you an idea of sort of what the agency, where it sort of takes the temperature of where the agency is coming from. A couple of final thoughts in terms of compliance. Make sure that you implement and document your outreach efforts. You have the tool through America's Job Exchange. If you're not familiar with it, I'm sure that they'll be happy to help you, kind of get acquainted with that tool. Make sure that you've got a framework to take a look at how effective each of your efforts are, and then make sure that each effort is actually evaluated at the end of the process. A point here, this is not always going to be quantitative, even though the agency may think that it is always quantitative. I think there is definitely a good case that not every outreach effort is going to result in a qualified hire. And then every 6 months, make sure that you're taking a look at your success of your efforts, course correct if you need to. Take a look at your utilization analyses. If you're running this for your update plans in your AAPs, take a look at how you're doing from a trend perspective. And if you're not making progress, don't be afraid to say, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to try something new, and hopefully that will yield better results. And that's, it's hard to say that sometimes when you're in the thick of a plan year, but it really is part of that sort of thoughtful self-analysis. Another tip here, the agency really is looking for personal outreach to local organizations. It is becoming increasingly important and asked about in the audits that we've supported. The agency actually mentioned at the NILG meeting recently, how are you reaching, so they said contractors in general, how are you reaching those who are not online? So even if all of your outreach activities are sort of the very basis of them are online, how are you going beyond those and reaching those folks who potentially aren't even online at this point? And that sort of personal outreach is where that comes into play. Taking a look at, kind of in conclusion here, again, make sure that you track what's currently happening. A lot of times there's good work that's going on within contractors and they just don't sort of take credit for it. So make sure that you go out there, take a look at what's currently happening and take credit for that. Make sure that your outreach efforts, you know how effective they are. Make sure you generate the paper and hold the paper because of the documentation requests. Know the areas where you should be targeting these folks. So potential areas of weakness in your plans. It is a tool that will help you identify those different areas, in order to make those steps of outreach. And then target your outreach wherever you have goals or wherever you're short of the benchmark. Local personal contacts to the extent possible within the organization. Provide an assessment of your outreach source along with an overall assessment. That's a good best practice to do that every 6 months so that you have it kind of a running piece of that available. And then don't be afraid to highlight where you're working, where it's actually working. So if you do have an outreach effort that results in a qualified hire, don't be afraid to highlight that, especially in an audit situation. So that's really all the tools that I have for you at this point in time. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take those now. Here's some contact information. Feel free to reach out to me directly as well. And with all that being said, that wraps up my presentation, and happy to answer questions if there are any.
Sonia, thank you very much. We actually don't have any questions at this time, but for everyone listening, you do have contact information for both AJE and Berkshire, so please do reach out as you go forward with these efforts and, if questions do arise. So this will conclude our broadcast. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to you, Sonia, for being here today as our subject matter expert. We hope you have a great vacation. And we hope to see all of you again, or have all of you again, on a future presentation. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.